We continue now at the top of Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph in Meseches Kiddushin. This is Kiddushin Daf 13a. On the previous Amud, the Gemara was discussing an incident where a man was mekadesh a woman with a mat, and the mat was not worth a pruta, and so they thought that it shouldn't be a good Kiddushin. After she received the mat, the man said that you should be mekudeshes with the money that is hidden within the mat. And she was silent, and Rava said that it was shtikusa, it's considered to be silence la'achar matan mos, after the giving of the money, and silence after the giving of the money is nothing. We don't say that her silence shows that she was accepting the Kiddushin, rather her silence simply might show that she thought what was originally given was certainly not a Kiddushin, and now it's over, and so therefore she's silent, she understands that it is not a good Kiddushin. And Rava continued on the previous Amud and said, I can bring a proof from a Braisa that shtika la'achar matan mos is nothing, that if she's silent after the money was already given, it's nothing. And the proof from the Braisa is that the Braisa says if a man says to a woman, take this sela and take it as a pikadon, you're going to watch over it, and then he says to her it should be for a Kiddushin, so if he says it should be for Kiddushin before he actually gives it to her, so then the Braisa says it's a good Kiddushin. But if he gives it to her first and then he says that it should be for Kiddushin, so then it depends. Ratzta, if she agrees, so then it's a good Kiddushin. But lo Ratzta, if she doesn't agree, so then it's not a good Kiddushin. And so then Rava says, in analyzing the Braisa, what does it mean when the Braisa says Ratzta or lo Ratzta? If it literally means Ratzta, she says she wants to be Mekudeshes, and lo Ratzta means she says she does not want to be Mekudeshes. But if that's the case, so even in a situation where before he gave it to her, he tells her it's for Kiddushin, but if lo Ratzta, if she said she didn't want, Ki Amra lo Nami have a Kiddushin, are we going to say in the Reish of the Braisa that when she says she doesn't want it to be a Kiddushin, that it is going to be a Kiddushin in that case? That doesn't make sense. Amai, why should that be the case? Vaka Amra lo, but she's saying she doesn't want it to be a Kiddushin, even if he says that it should be for Kiddushin before he gives it to her. But if it's lo Ratzta, if she says she doesn't want it, of course it's not going to be a Kiddushin. And so therefore Rava says, Elalav, rather is it not, Ratzta de Amra'in. Ratzta means she says, yes, I want it to be a Kiddushin. In other words, at the end of the Braisa, the case is after he gives it to her, he then says that he wants it to be for Kiddushin, and she says yes, so then it's going to be Kiddushin. But lo Ratzta, what does it mean lo Ratzta? It means the Ishtaka, it means that she was silent. The Ishtaka Mishtaka, it's a case where she was silent. Ushma mina shtika de lachar matan mos v'lo klumi. And we see from this Braisa that when she's silent after the money is given, it's nothing. In other words, that's exactly what the Braisa is saying. In a case where he says that it should be for Kiddushin before he gives it to her, and she receives it and she's silent, then it's a good Kiddushin. But if he gives it to her first, and then he says it should be for Kiddushin, and she is silent, so that's not considered anything, and that is not going to be a good Kiddushin. But the Gemara continues, Kashu ba b'fum nara. They had a difficulty on this in Pum Nara. Mishmei de Rav Huna b'rei de Rav Yoshua. They had a question in the name of Rav Huna b'rei de Rav Yoshua. And the question is as follows. Mi dami, can you really compare the two cases? Can you really compare a case where he gives her the money, and after the fact, like in the Braisa, he changes it from a deposit to a Kiddushin? Can you really compare that to a case where he gives her the mat, and after she takes it, he tells her there's money inside it, and she's silent? You can't compare the two cases. Why? Because over there, b'toras pikadon yahavinu nehila, it was given to her as a deposit to watch over, to protect. She's chayiv if something goes wrong. So therefore she thinks, ishadinu lahu mitveri, if I'm going to throw it aside and break it, mechayavna buhu, I'm going to be chayiv to pay for it. In other words, her silence, the reason why she's being silent, it's obvious she's not accepting the Kiddushin. She's being silent because she doesn't want to throw it aside, even though she has no interest in the Kiddushin, but she doesn't want to throw it aside because she thinks it's a pikadon, she has to watch over it. But over here in the case of the mat, so in the case of the mat, he was giving it as a Kiddushin either way. It's just initially when she received it, she thought it wasn't worth a pruta, and then later he tells her there's money inside of it. So hacha over here, b'toras Kiddushin yavinu nehila, he's giving it to her as a Kiddushin. V'isa de lo nichla, now if it was really true she didn't want a Kiddushin, lishdinu, she should have thrown it aside, and so therefore in this case of Rava's case, really the silence maybe shows that she does accept the Kiddushin. But the Gemara says, Parach Rav Achoy asks on this, Atu kulu nashi dina gemiri. Do you think that all the women, they know all of the halachas? That's not true. Hachanami, here also in the case where she receives the mat, Savra, maybe she thinks the same thing. Isha dina lahu, if I throw it aside, umitveri, and it breaks, mischayavna bachruisai, I'm going to be chayiv for. In other words, it's identical. The two cases are identical, just like in the Braisa, we assume that her silence does not mean anything about acceptance of the Kiddushin. So too over here, her silence does not mean she's accepting the Kiddushin. It just means she's nervous that if she throws it aside, so she might be chayiv. And the Gemara in any case continues, Sholcha Rav Acha bar Rav l'kamei de Ravina. Rav Acha bar Rav sent this question in front of Ravina, what would be the halach in this case, again where she's silent after the money was given. Ki agav namai, what would be the halacha? Sholach le, he sent to him, Anon lo shmiya lo an hadar Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua. We never heard this question of Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua. In other words, Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua had argued that the brisa is not a good proof, because in the case of the brisa over there, her silence is not necessarily a kiddushin, but maybe over here her silence is a kiddushin. That was Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua's question, but we never heard such a question. But atun deshmiya lechu, but you who heard that distinction, you who heard that question and heard Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua's concern that maybe over here by the case of the mat, really her silence is an indication that it's a kiddushin because she should have thrown it aside. So chushula, you have to be concerned that maybe it is in fact a kiddushin if you heard such a concern from Rav Huna breid Rav Yoshua. And the Gemara continues, there was a woman who was selling belts. Also, a certain man came, he snatched a belt from her. Amra lei, she said to him, Havanihili, give it to me. Amar lo, he said to her, Yahivn Allah, if I give it to you, Mekudeshesli, will you be Mekudeshes to me? Shakalte v'ishtika, she took it and she was silent. V'yamar Rav Nachman, and Rav Nachman said on that, Yechola l'meimar, she can say, in shakli v'didi shakli, yes, I took it, but I took what was mine. It wasn't for the purposes of kiddushin. And so therefore, in this case, according to Rav Nachman, it's not a kiddushin. Eisvei Rava Rav Nachman, Rava asked Rav Nachman the following question. Kitsha begazel uvechamas uvegneva. It says, let's say a man is mekadesh a woman with gazel, with something that was stolen, or chamas, something that he coerced the sale, he coerced the seller to sell it to him, uvegneva, also something that was stolen, or shechatav selah miyad, or let's say he took a selah from her hand, the kitchen, then he used that to be mekadesh her. Mekudesha, so it's a good kiddushin. So you see over here, the exact opposite of what we said above. Here, if he takes it from her and gives it back to her for kiddushin, it is going to be considered a kiddushin. And over there, before, if Nachman said that she can say, shakli v'didi shakli, what I took was mine, and it's not a kiddushin. And the Gemara says, Hasam over there, b'deshadich. The case over there is, the reason why it's a good kiddushin when it says he took a selah from her hand and then gave it back to her for kiddushin, the reason why it was a good kiddushin is because there was already a shidduch in that case. There was already an arrangement in place to get married, and so therefore we assume it's a good kiddushin. And the Gemara says, and from where do we know that we make such a distinction between where there was a shidduch and where there was no shidduch? The Tanya, because we learned in a brisa, Amar lo kinsi sela zu shani chayiv lechi. Let's say he says to her, take the selah which I'm chayiv to you. But then he says to her, hiskachi libo, I want it to be a kiddushin. So the Brisa says, B'shas matan mos, if he says it at the time he's giving the money, meaning before he actually gives the money, he says that it should be for a kiddushin. So ratzta mikudeshes, if she agrees, so it's a good kiddushin. Lo ratzta ina mikudeshes, if she doesn't agree, it's not a good kiddushin. La'achar matan mos, let's say he tells this to her after he gives her the money, so afilu ratzta ina mikudeshes, even if she agrees, it's not a good kiddushin. And so again, the Gemara analyzes the brisa similar to the analysis of the brisa in the previous Amud. My rotzto, my lo rotzto. What does it mean over here when it says she agrees? What does it mean when she doesn't agree? Ilay mo rotzto da amra in lo rotzto da amra lo. If you're going to say that rotzto means she says yes, I want it to be a kedushin, and lo rotzto means she says no, and she's saying she doesn't want it to be a kedushin. So ha'ishtaka have a kedushin. That would imply that if she was silent, it would be a kedushin. But if that's the case, so in the reisha, if when she'd be silent, it would be a good kiddushin, just say that. V'nisni mikudesha stam. It should just say, in a situation where before he gave her the money, he said he wants it to be a kiddushin, it should just say mikudeshes. And we're going to know it's obvious, it's only talking about where she doesn't say no. If she says no, it's never a kiddushin. So if it would just say mikudesha stam, we would understand. If she says yes, it's a kiddushin. If she's silent, it's a kiddushin. So we would understand that that is the case. Ki hasam, it should say just like over there, just like the previous brisa, where we said that's what it meant. Where she says nothing, it's a good kiddushin. It just said mikudeshes. Ella, rather, how do you have to interpret the brisa? Rotzta da amra. In the case of rotzta in the brisa, where she agrees, that's where she says yes. And lo rotzta, the case of lo rotzta again, where before he gives it to her, he says that it should be for kiddushin. And lo rotzta, what does that mean? That means the ishtuka. That means that she's silent. The katani de eina mikudeshes. And what does it say in the reish of the brisa? It says in a case of silence, it's not a good kiddushin. My time, and what's the reason it's not a good kiddushin? Yechola l'meimer, because she could say in shakli v'didi shakli. Yes, I took it, but I took what was mine, because again, he originally said to her, take take this sela that I'm chayiv to you, and then before he gives it to her, he changes and he says it should be for Kiddushin, and then she takes it and she's silent, it's not a good Kiddushin, because she's saying she's taking what was hers. V'yala kasha hach. Now, if that's the case in this brisa, so then we have a kasha from the above brisa, because the above brisa said that if he snatched a sela for her and then gave it to her for Kiddushin, it is considered to be a good Kiddushin. So what's the answer to the contradiction? The kidsha begezel v'chamas u'v'gneva or shechotaf sela miyada v'kidsha mekudesh. Again, it's a question from the above brisa where he was mekadesh with something that was stolen, or he snatched the sela from her and then he gave it back to her where it said it is a good Kiddushin. Elalav shmami no, but rather don't we see from here hadeshadich hadelo shadich, that we make this distinction between where there was a previous shidduch to get married, where there was a previous arrangement to get married. That's what we're talking about in the case of kidsha begezel v'chamas u'v'gneva or shechotaf sela miyada. In that case, in that first brisa where it says it's a good Kiddushin, there was a shidduch, there was an arrangement, that's why it's a good Kiddushin. But over here in this brisa where it's not a good Kiddushin, where she's silent, that's because there was no arrangement, and so she says what I took was really mine. And the Gemara continues, Kinoch nafshe de Ravasi, when Ravasi died, Ailu Rabbanon l'nekutinu l'shmaitze, the Rabbanon went up to collect his teachings, to review his teachings. Amar lahu hahume Rabbanon v'Rabbi Yaakov Shemei, one of the Rabbanon whose name was Rabbi Yaakov, he said to them, Hachi Amar Ravasi Amar Rav Mani, so said Ravasi, that Rav Mani said, Keshem she'ein isha niknas b'pachos mishava pruta, just like a woman is not acquired with less than a shava pruta, kach ein karka niknas b'pachos mishava pruta, so too land cannot be acquired with less than a shava pruta. Amrulei, they said to him, V'atanya, but we learned in a brisa, Afal pisha ein isha niknas b'pachos mishava pruta, that even though a woman is not acquired with less than a shava pruta, karka niknas b'pachos mishava pruta. On the contrary, land is able to be acquired with less than a shava pruta. Amar Lui said to them, Kitanya ahi b'chalipin. That brisa is not talking about acquiring through kesef, through kinyan of money. It's talking about a kinyan chalipin, and there it actually can be less than a shava pruta. The Tanya, as we learned in a brisa, konin b'kli, you can acquire with a kli that refers to a kinyan chalipin, v'afapi she'ein bo shava pruta. Even though it's not worth a pruta, still that kinyan is effective. By chalipin, the kinyan can work even less than a shava pruta. Hadar Yasvi v'kamri, then they were sitting and they said as follows, Hadar Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, that which Rav Yehuda said, that Shmuel said, Kol she'enu yodea b'tiv gittin v'kiddushin, anyone who doesn't know the halachas of gittin and kiddushin, lo yehelo esak imon, he shouldn't deal with those halachas at all. Amar Ravasi Amar Rav Yochanan, so on that Ravasi said that Rav Yochanan said, V'koshin liolam yosur midor hamabel, this is worse to the world, it's worse than the generation of the Mabel. And Rashi explains, Hadar Yasvi v'ka'amri b'shmaita de Ravasi, again, another teaching of Ravasi. Hadam Rav Yehuda Amar Ravasi Allah. Ravasi said on that teaching that you need to be an expert in order to deal with it. He said, Kashim liolam dayonim hamorim hora ba'arayos. It is very difficult for the world when you have judges who issue rulings that have to do with arayos. Ve'enam bekim yoser midor hamabel, and they're not experts. It's even more difficult for the world than the dor hamabel. And where do we see that? Shenemar, as the pasuk says, Olav v'chachesh v'ratzoch v'gon. It talks about different kinds of sins, talks about false oaths and lies and murder and stealing and adultery, and then it says partsu v'damim minagu. It says again they've committed all of these sins and blood touches blood, and you see from that pasuk it's talking about these issues of arayos, and it's talking about the dor hamabel. And the Gemara says, "My mashma." Well, where do you see all of this from the pasuk? And the Gemara says to that, "Kidemitargim Rav Yosef." It's like Rav Yosef translated the pasuk. Molden benin mineshei chavrein chovin al chovin mosifin. When it talks about damim b'damim nagu, it talks about the fact that they're having children from the wives of their colleagues, and they add sin upon sin. Uchsiv, and then what's written in the pasuk? It goes on to say, "Al kein teva lo'aretz v'umlo kol yosheb ba v'chayas asadu v'ofa shemayim v'gam degei hayom yasefu." It says that the land is going to mourn because of these sins, and then it says even the fish of the sea, they're also going to die. That's even worse than the mabel. V'ilu b'dor hamabel, because whereas by the dor hamabel lo nigzera gezera al dogim shebeyam, there was no decree against the fish in the sea. Shenemar, like it says, mikol asher b'charava mesu, everything on the dry land died. V'lo dogim shebeyam, and not the fish in the sea. And so therefore you see that for this sin over here, the sin of adultery, it's even worse than the mabel. And the Gemara says, V'iluhach, again, whereas over here, afilu dagim shebayam, even the fish in the sea, they're also dying, it's even worse than the mabel. But the Gemara still says, V'ema ado avid lekulu, but how do you know that's the meaning of the pasuk? The pasuk is talking about all kinds of sins, Allah v'chachesh, ratzoach, gonov, all of these different sins. Maybe you have to do all of these sins for it to be so bad that it's worse than the mabel. And the Gemara says to that, Lo salkadaitach, don't think that's the case, because it's also written in the pasuk, Kim ipnei Allah avla haaretz, because of the oaths, the land is destroyed. That was just one of the things in the list. And so therefore you see just for one of the things in the list, you can have the land mourns. Rashi says, because of the oath, that's why the land mourns, just because of the Allah alone. You see that on each thing in the list in the pasuk, it's saying, the pasuk is saying, Al Kain Te'avel, that the land mourns. Because Allah was just one of the things in the earlier pasuk, and so therefore you see on each item in the pasuk, including adultery, again it's worse than the mabul. But the Gemara says, how do you know? Maybe Allah is in its own category, that alone is such a severe sin, and all the other ones, they all have to be combined, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Beis.